Hello everyone, my name is Alana and I am a part of the Invice team here in Asia Pacific. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, A Guide to Artificial Intelligence for Water Use in the Mining Industry. Now, as we wait for a few more people to join, a little background on our company. Here at Innovice, we have a mission to empower professionals around the world to successfully create, manage and maintain their water operations. We are the global leader in water infrastructure data analytics software, providing innovative decision-making software solutions for lasting customer success. Our artificial intelligence software intelligently manages processes in real time. So using AI that learns from your site's past performance, Imagine prescribes optimal control actions based on your site goals and your system's real-time and forecasted conditions. Now, during today's webinar, we do encourage you to ask any questions that you have along the way in the questions box to the left of your screen. Any questions will be answered either during or after today's webinar by James. You will have an opportunity also at the end of the webinar to ask any questions that you haven't been able to. Now to meet your host for today. James Leake is the Director of Artificial Intelligence Products here at Innovize. James is a technology executive who has worked across the water, transportation, education, medical, and wireless industries for the past 15 years. He has launched products to millions of customers globally in the enterprise, SaaS, and hardware sectors. He strives to apply technology in a seamless manner to real-world use cases with the goal to improve humanity on a global scale. James lives in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and holds a BMath in Computer Science from the University of Waterloo and an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier University. Outside of work, James enjoys spending time with his wife and young daughter as they travel the world. So, with all of that being said, please take it away, James.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Alana. I appreciate that introduction. I'm excited to be here today to learn a bit more about some folks' questions, but really we're going to dive in and start covering about how we can apply artificial intelligence in the mining industry. So a bit about what we're going to cover today. First item, we're going to talk a bit about key water challenges in the mining industry and what are some of the solutions to that. We'll talk a bit about how AI is helping mining companies reduce their OpEx costs and address some of those challenges. And then we'll change tracks a bit and look at, is the data you have up to scratch? Is it good enough to use for AI to help you optimize? That's always a big concern, and rightly so. So we have some data there we can investigate and chat about. And also how to determine if your site qualifies for AI. Just because you have your data might be up to scratch, do you have the other right attributes to leverage AI to do optimization in your water process at a mining site? So a lot of exciting content. Please make sure to always get your questions coming in, as Lana mentioned. We'll be monitoring that as we go, and we'll answer them at the end. So with that, we'll jump in. So we'll start with key water challenges in the mining industry. And some of the key things we see, of course, is water scarcity. I think in some regions where it depends on the region, but in some regions certainly attaining water in it for a mine that's in a remote location can be challenging. I think you're seeing regulations changing globally as well and regionally, where you may be competing for water, getting that source water. It may not just be the mine, maybe other businesses, other commercial operations trying to get that water. There may be entities limiting the amount of water you can source for your mine. And all of that's kind of driving water scarcity, which is also helping folks look at new technologies and how they can reuse some of that water as well. It's highly advantageous if you can reuse some of that source water when it comes out as waste, but retreat it and then feed it back into the cycle. And we'll talk a bit about that more. Compliance is the second big one. I think what we're seeing globally is that the total suspended solids in a lot of the effluent discharge coming out of mines is becoming tightening. And this has an adverse impact. It means it's more challenging to make sure you meet those requirements or have to pay penalties if you don't, depending on your region. But it also means you have to step up your water process, both in source water treatment and wastewater treatment, to make sure you can achieve that compliance. And compliance also could take another form. It could simply be just the form with which you need to make sure your wastewater is good enough for reuse. Maybe your own internal compliance, right? You don't have enough water scarcity, so you invest in technology to reuse that water. How do you ensure you're optimally running that reuse cycle that commonly uses membranes and make sure you're compliant, that you have good source water coming back in? And then finally, thirdly, is the water process knowledge. So as a mine, it's not your first priority is of course not water. it's mining that precious metal or whatever that item may be that you're trying to extract from the ground. And a lot of the times you have water process folks on staff, or you may just have some folks doing double duty, and they may not be trained classically as a water expert, but they've grown over time to know and understand that. And so how do you increase that water knowledge? And then if you step back and say, okay, I may be looking at new technologies to reuse water and treat my wastewater to make it usable as processed water again. How do I upskill my operators and my process experts to know how to do that process as I add that new technology? As I add new technologies to meet my increasing TSS, total suspended solids regulations and limits, how do I upskill my process experts again to understand how to adapt and control that process in a much more fine-tuned manner? Those are some of the common themes and challenges we see for water use as it pertains to the mining industry. So we'll talk a bit more about those and break them down. And so what we see if we take a step back and look at operations, we see water plant operators make dozens of complex operational decisions based on human judgment and experience every day. And it's not just water plant operators, it is anyone in your entire your process, the mining process. They're making dozens of complex operational decisions. You have some ability and some aids in some areas. When it comes to the water plant operators, that's really where we can come in as an advisor and help specialize and support your team there, either augmenting the skills they already have, or even upscaling their ability with AI to give them additional knowledge on how they can operate that facility, how they can optimally operate it more directly, alert them to conditions that are happening, let them prevent that, and really change their water operations from a more maybe reactive approach, as we show here, to a more proactive approach where we're forecasting what's going to happen. We try to prevent that from happening and work around it, and really help optimize those operations. And that's where the Imagine product comes in from Innovyze. And it's leveraging AI, and it empowers our process water and wastewater operations with the ability to intelligently manage their processes in real time. And so it's not just about knowing the data and seeing the real-time data and from an analytics perspective. Of course, we do that too. But it's about gathering intelligence from that data and prescribing what to do to meet the effluent compliance limits, to meet your operational process constraints, to meet your treatment constraints for water, whether it be waste or source water. And how do you optimally do that and not have to worry about that with additional data and insight? So that's great. That's all good and well. But how is AI actually helping mining companies reduce their OpEx costs by the above? So let's dig into that a bit more. So Imagine itself, we like to say, is an outcome-driven platform with a 6-month payback. So generally, the cost savings you're able to achieve are paid back within 6 months for the software. It is a SaaS platform offering, so we do continue driving those savings year over year as you go. Of course, you're always getting sustained value from SaaS. That's part of the value proposition of it. We also like to say we can generally save in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% on your OpEx costs as it relates to water in your process. And we also are conserving costs in that existing budget. Since we have that 6-month payback, you're not actually getting new budget to pay for the software. You can use the budget, your money you already have, pay for the software and put more money back in your pocket. Now, the way we're going to get to those savings is usually there's 3 common areas we do that, and we'll tailor this to your mine and your site. But commonly, chemical treatment savings is a big one, energy savings, and of course, improved process compliance, reducing non-compliance events or driving to new tighten compliance events. But let's dive in a bit more on that. So we like to kind of, under the umbrella of intelligent control, break that down a bit more. So chemicals, commonly in the mining and the water treatment sector, it's about flocculation and coagulation, and the chemicals required to do that both in your source water treatment and your effluent water treatment. And what we can do is leverage that AI to help do more predictive chemical dosing, as we call it. So we optimally dose the right amount of chemicals to ensure you're compliant on your effluent limits. What we found is that typically customers have figured out a way to make sure you're compliant, but they may not know if you're using the minimum amount of chemicals to do that. So you commonly may be overdosing chemicals to achieve compliance. And that can be costly to you over time as you continue using more and more chemicals. And that also changes as chemicals change price in the market, or as regulations change on use of chemicals. There may be opportunity for savings there, and typically we'll see that. Conversely, on energy, the same idea. A lot of the time, whether it's pumps or blowers, depending on the actual water treatment process you're using in your mine, But trying to minimize those system-wide energy costs is one thing we'll focus on. So we're not just trying to optimize a single asset, a pump here and a pump there. We're actually optimizing the system as a whole. So we're taking into account all the pumps, all the blowers, all the other energy consuming assets, and saying, how do we optimize this system given how you pay for energy, your energy tariff structure? So we'll look at things like the peak demand, how your energy price fluctuates over time, and take that into account as we try to optimize that system energy cost, but still meeting your targets, which commonly in wastewater would be your effluence target discharges, or in process water treatment is the quality of water you want coming into your mining process. And then thirdly, it's reducing compliance risk, and which firstly is just the ability to not be non-compliant. So let's ensure we're not. And then secondly, it's how do we plan for and meet tightening discharge limits. So if you have tightening total suspended solids limits coming, how can you start looking ahead to do that? And we can do, the AI can actually look ahead and say, okay, if we were to meet these new requirements, what would I need to do in my change in my process with respect to chemicals or energy or operating modes or constraints? And it can help give you a look ahead so you can get there without having to be non-compliant, without having to do trial and error. So that's one of the big advantages we've seen our customers use in the past. Now, how does this get applied to the mining process? So here's a very simplified diagram, I admit. But we'll abstract a bit away the mining process, because what we're really talking about here is the water as it relates to the mining process. But in the top left, we of course have process water intake. So you've sourced water from somewhere, generally fresh water. But if it's salt water or brackish water, you may have to treat that. So your water treatment process may take a few different forms depending on the water you're sourcing, or it might take multiple forms if you source one or all of the above. But you're ultimately going to take in some of that processed water. That's an area in purple there we can help in that water treatment side. So we can help optimize the energy as it relates to how you process that water. We can help optimize some of the membranes maybe that you might be using. We can also help optimize the amount of chemicals you're putting in to treat that water to make it suitable for use in your mining process. So that's a key area the Imagine product by Innovyze can help. Once we get that processed water treated into sufficient quality, it goes into our mining process where we may use it for cooling, for cleaning, for dust suppression, for many different things. But ultimately, it's going to come back out as waste in some shape or form as effluent. So commonly, we'll see that coming back out in the right bottom there, the purple item called wastewater treatment. And what we commonly see with most customers is that they may be trying to actually reuse some of that water. So they may divert some of that back to the left, run that through some reverse osmosis membranes to help remove a lot of the particles and make it reusable for water treatment coming back in. So they may have a nice cycle going there. We're seeing a lot of companies looking towards that as a way to reduce their need on the processed water intake, driven by regulation, the climate, and just regional legislation, and adding those new technologies. Or even if you're not doing that, you're ultimately still discharging that water somewhere, whether it may be back to the water source you came from, to a lake, a river, a stream, even a lagoon. There's definitely some discharge happening there. And generally there'll be some kind of limits you have varying depending on where you're discharging to, but we can help optimize in those processes. So again, to kind of recap, we can help treat that processed water when it's coming in before you use it in your mining processes. We can help treat the wastewater coming out of those mining processes, of which there's a few sources. And then after wastewater, we can make sure the effluent is of the right quality, we can also help you retreat maybe some of that wastewater to ensure it can come back in as treated water again, and give you a bit more of a water cycle that a lot of companies are striving for from a sustainability target. So that's a bit about how the product can be applied to the mining process. We're really excited about what our customers are doing, and we'd like to talk more. So quick reminder, make sure you're getting your questions in. We'll be reviewing them once we get to the end. So switching tracks a bit. So you may say, James, well, that sounds great and all, but I've got concerns about my data. Do I have the right data? Do I have enough data? How do we handle the challenges in data? As we all know, data is never clean, it's never perfect. And that's been some of the challenge in the past when we've used more physics-based or numerical-based models to try and do some of this. They rely on good, solid, clean data, and sometimes we just don't have it. But I'll do a bit of an AI and data primer here to set some groundwork. It's interesting. Folks are probably aware of machine learning. It's been proven powerful in many different ways. Imaging for facial recognition. I'm sure folks have seen Google Photos and heard about other facial recognition technologies around that, it's gotten pretty good, the AI's ability to recognize a face and recognize whose face that is, even scary good. And we've also seen a lot of advances in natural language and speech processing, and this takes the form of voice assistants. Almost every smartphone today has a voice assistant of some sort, whether it's from Apple or Samsung or Android and Google. They're out there. We even see them in the forms of Alexas from Amazon. They become pretty prevalent across almost every interaction point you have. A lot of that's driven by machine learning. So there's been a lot of investment in the industry and the sectors doing that. And the reason they've been able to make so much progress is there's large annotated data sets to leverage for training has really enabled them to do that. Now, we're going to change tracks a bit and say, okay, how does this apply to industrial use cases and water specifically? Well, our data is a bit different here. Our data is in what we call time series format. It's a sensor that does a reading every 10 seconds maybe and stores that, and ultimately it stores a record of over time of how that value of that sensor changed. Maybe it's reading the total suspended solids, the TSS, the pH, or the flow rate, but it's storing that over time. So the data is commonly in time series format. It's not of the form of photos, or it's not of the form of spoken language. And secondly, a lot of our historical data is unlikely to be annotated. And annotated means, in the case of photos, you could say, well, that photo is of James, I know it's of James, and that photo over there is of Alice, I know it's of Alice. And the AI can use that to then try and go match them. But when we look at time series data, that's not as easy to do because the data commonly isn't annotated. You may have years of data and you're a data historian, but is it annotated with all the events that happened over time? A lot of folks may say, you know what, it's actually in my maintenance logbooks that have that, and they're not really connected. So there's a big gap we've seen is how do we backfill that annotation? And then also the analysis of time series data is a bit different than analyzing photos or spoken language. It's about time-dependent patterns. What are the cycles that happen maybe daily or weekly or monthly in your processes? And how do you analyze those over time and see how they change? That's really what you want to see in some of the time series data. And so some of the strategies that have been used and have really been springing up and driving process and progress in AI and industrial water treatment is things like clustering, classification, anomaly detection, and forecasting. So clustering commonly is our ability to cluster similar likewise events. And given that, we kind of create our own annotation, maybe able to classify those events. Anomaly detection is a big one. So if something that is non-standard sticks out in the process, can we flag that and know about it, and then not train against it or track to train against it? And then simply just forecasting what will happen, and that allows you to look ahead into the future and try to run things optimally. And so Imagine by Innovyze uses a lot of those different tactics, but that's just a kind of a bit of a primer on what we've seen AI in the more commercial personal space, and now we're seeing a lot of progress happening in the industrial space. But it's a bit of a different challenge with the data. And you may say, okay, James, that's good. I've got some sensors, but you know what? I got a pretty remote mine here, and some of my sensors are actually IoT sensors, and they kind of drop out because of just the remote location now and again. And that's a common use case we see. We see that result is just a gap in data, like we have on the chart on the right. Or it could just be you have an asset or a sensor in your system is down for maintenance and outage, or maybe you're just upgrading it. There's many reasons why. And sometimes it could just be infrequently sampled data is why there's gaps in data. So how does the AI handle this? So one of the strategies we use is what we call the use of virtual sensors. And so sensors are trained to fill in the type of gap seen in the historical data. So if we have an IoT sensor that drops for an hour here, an hour there, we can usually train a model to fill in that data of how common operations have happened, given how the rest of the system is operating. So a lot of those short-term outages are pretty easy to be handled by AI, where in the past they might not be. Longer-term outages are usually need a smarter strategy to fill them, just because the time gap there, I'm talking days, multiple days here, not just an hour or two, makes it more challenging. But let's jump into that as well. So let's go with a use case here. Let's say lab sample data. It has a gap in the data by design. You may only sample something every 8 hours. For example, maybe you only sample your TSS, your suspended solids, every 8 hours. But it's critical for an AI system to know what's happening on that operational constraint in that process. So how do you backfill some of that data? And so one way we've done that is use AI. We can actually predict the lab sample data at more frequent intervals after trained on historical data. So if we look in the graph on the top right, That's an example of sample data at every 8-hour intervals. And then the bottom is sort of an AI model that's generating and filling in those in-between things and giving you a bit better of an accurate prediction of what's actually happening in that system based on the rest of the process. It's not done in a vacuum. So example, if we build a model off of how the flocculant dosing correlates to effluent discharge, it is one way we correlate that. We know that given this amount of flocculant chemical coming in, we'll achieve this amount of chemical effluent coming out. We can build the model around that. But it also remains guided by the lab sample data. So we're almost getting best of both worlds. We're taking the data we have that's sampled, and we're using that to feed the model, also feeding that lab sample data back in real time as we keep filling it in every 8 hours. So there's a lot of different tools in our machine learning engineers toolboxes they can use to help sort and fill out the data. And this is a big thing we'll do when we talk to customers as part of that qualification and discussion process. We'll analyze the data quality. We'll give you a bit of a report back and say, okay, here's the quality of your data. Here's areas that we could improve on, but here's what we can do with the current quality of data and the savings that we could expect. We'll talk a bit about that more. But so that's a bit of a data primer, so a bit of a school lesson there. But it's interesting to some folks, and it's definitely a concern we see come up amongst typical customers. But looking at this differently, does my site qualify? Your site is not just about the data, it's about a few more things. So let's dive into how AI can work for your site. So data and sensors. So we talked about data, but what is the actual data we need? It's not just about gaps. What is the actual data? So a lot of the time, a key data we need in your system is having online quality sensors at inlets and outlets of the water treatment process. And quality sensors usually mean things like flow, total suspended solids, pH, other relevant kind of chemical readings. But we'll need about both inlet and outlets. We need to know what's coming in and what's going out. And in that way, we can kind of model what's happening in that process, given what's coming in and going out, and the intermediate sensor readings there. The second key item we need is power submetering. And this basically means for those assets that are actually consuming a lot of energy in that process, such as pumps or a blower, do we have good power submetering on those so we can know how much energy is being consumed by them? It's key to know how much is being consumed because we're going to want to try and optimize that. So we need to know how much it actually is so we can calculate the savings. And then thirdly, it's chemical dosing readings from metered pumps. So namely where you are dosing your flocculants or coagulants in that system, are you reading how much you're dosing? Either this is a concentration of chemical or a volume, it doesn't matter, but as long as there's some way to measure how much you're actually putting into the system, so you can get that back. Second big item, so kind of a different tactic here. So let's say you have those data sensors and that data coming in. Looking at this differently, does your site have SCADA for control of the water process? SCADA commonly is used in many manufacturing process to control the system. And likewise, we'll need it here. The AI is ultimately going to provide some recommendations on how to operate your system, but if you can't actually use a SCADA control system to do that, it's going to be challenging. So most people, the answer is obviously, of course, I have SCADA, but it's something we ask all our customers. Second item for that is not just that you have SCADA, but do you have a historian sitting beside it capturing your historical data? AI is the type of technology that most folks have maybe heard about, and most folks also understand that we have to train AI models. And the way we train them is we use historical data. So commonly we'll get 1 to 2 years of data from a typical customer, and that will usually come under their SCADA historian system. So it's definitely a requirement there. We'll need, or if you don't have a historian, but you have 2 years of historical data somewhere else, we can leverage that. Even if it's written in logbooks, as long as we can get it into an electronic format, it's possible to leverage it. And then thirdly is, can you remotely control your process via SCADA? So we find customers, in some customers that aren't as mature, they may have SCADA, they may have the historian, but if they actually manually control, like they may have the operators walking out to the pumps, to the chemical set points and manually dosing them, that will make it challenging as well, because the AI is going to prescribe some optimal ways to run those pumps, to do that chemical dosing, to run that process. And if you can't do that remotely, it can be challenging to get the most of savings and the most optimization. So it's definitely key to have the ability to remotely control that process as it relates to energy and chemicals in your system, so you can optimally reduce the costs in operation and increase efficiency. And then finally is, do you operate your water process 24/7? The AI is going to try and optimize across 24/7 because operations run 24/7. We have seen one customer here or there that may only run a day shift, Most folks run 24/7, but it's a good thing to consider is, do you run a 24/7 operation so we can optimize that full set. And then finally, I'd say if you're unsure, I think, we'd love to hear from you. Contact one of our Innovyze experts. We're always out there looking to do risk-free assessments of your water operations. We'll come in, we'll go through all those qualification questions with you. We'll talk a lot more about what's going to happen and how it works. We'll do that assessment, and we can come back to you with an estimate of what your savings will be, to give you an ability to then understand how that would apply to your site or multiple sites. So that's where I'd like to leave it. I'd like to welcome you to submit your questions. Give me a few seconds here. I'll look through the questions that have come in, and we'll get going on answering a couple of those. Okay, so we've got a couple questions here. It looks like folks are asking, well, how does implementation actually work? What does that look like? What does that process go? So we didn't really talk about that, but let's say we've gotten to your site, we've done the assessment, we can save you money in your operations. We validated that you have the right data, you have the right sensors, you have that in place. What does it actually look like? How do I go back to my boss and say, this is what it will look like, the time it'll take? So I've got some backup slides here. Let me jump into those. So AI implementation. So here's a kind of a nice way we kind of draw this out for folks, is we do have the first phase is usually installation. So, after if we agree to move forward, the first phase is the installation. And a big part of this installation starts off with an 8-week process where we'll have kickoff meetings with you. We'll define the site objectives in a detailed manner. We'll make sure we have the data. We'll gather that historical data from you. So I mentioned that 1 to 2 years historical data. We'll need to actually get that from you in one way or shape or form. Usually folks can export this pretty easily from their systems. And then we'll also look up real-time data. So we didn't talk a lot about real-time data, but the AI will learn from the historical data, but then it will operate in the future from real-time data. So once it's trained and has learned, it will then start reading what's happening in real time and will adapt and optimize to that. So there's 2 kind of key data operations we'll have to do in that installation process. And we commonly work with your IT systems to do that. It's generally pretty easy to work with those teams and get the data integration working. More internally in that installation phase is the modeling and validation along with end user training. So we of course will build the AI models, train them, validate them, and then also train your operators on how to use the software. And then the second part of that installation phase is the subscription baseline established. So to guarantee that we have that 6-month payback period we talked about at the start, we will run the product for 30 days with you, establish what that baseline of savings is, and start saving. We'll of course have done our analysis beforehand to give our best guess of what the savings would be, but we like to use the real life operation to determine what that baseline price will be to get those savings. And then phase 2, after about those 8 to 12 weeks, is when we go fully live. And a 6-month payback price is established, and we're running in production. We're optimizing with you. Our team is monitoring behind the scenes the performance of the AI models and dynamically retuning them as needed. Touching base with you as well to see how things are going, how your operations are changing, how the optimizations are actually driving change in your system and in what you're seeing, so we can understand that very detailed. Okay, so that's a bit about implementation. I think there's some follow-on questions from this now that people want to understand a bit more about how it works, how that data integration works, and what actually happens and what it looks like. So in the next slide, I have actually touched on that fairly well, but that seems like a common theme in the questions coming in. So a bit more about how it works. We talked about this at a high level. We mentioned SCADA a lot, but it's not just SCADA data sources. We mentioned IoT sensors too, but any customer data sources that are critical to the water process. SCADA is commonly where a lot of that data gets centralized, but if you're using IoT sensors and gathering data from far-reaching places, sometimes that may be coming in via a separate platform, so we can ingest that. Your CMMS maintenance systems, if there's relevant data in there for anomaly detection you may want to do, we would gather that. And then your LIMS systems as well. If you have any lab sample data, like we mentioned TSS before, well, we would gather that as well. And then usually there's third-party data sources we'll ingest as well. So weather is a huge one for us. Weather is a big indicator of how things will change. A little bit less so mining, but it's certainly an impactful because it'll change what, namely precipitation, what's coming into your system, what's coming into your water process is affected there. So we'll ingest that from third party while we'll work with our platform to get that set up and running. And then we'll work with your IT department to integrate your internal data sources. From there, it'll get ingested into the system. Our machine learning models will run and we'll provide back recommendations in what we call advisory mode. So we're not going to take control of your operations. We're just going to advise on how to optimally run them. Your operators will have a web dashboard available to them so they can see what those recommendations look like. They can see the impacts on the system, and then they can take those recommendations and input them back into their SCADA system to run the optimizations. We also deliver by email and SMS. Recognize that operators don't sit in front of a web dashboard every day, so you can get those recommendations updated every couple hours to your phone and tell you what should be happening next and what events are happening in the system. And then finally, that results in the optimizations, that results in the cost savings following those recommendations. So that's a bit more about how it works and how it goes there. So I'm noticing another theme in questions here. There's a bit of a theme on, well, how does the AI actually optimize? Like, what does the AI do? A lot of folks think the AI is a bit of a black box in what it does, and I think that's worthwhile jumping in a bit to learn a bit more about how our AI optimizes, how it works, how we do control it and guide it. So we got one more slide here that I think that's useful. So the first thing is we build what we call an AI digital twin. So I think digital twin is a pretty common term in the industry that means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think to us here, it means we're building an AI-enabled digital twin. So we're going to take your process flow diagram or your process and instrumentation diagram and analyze that and build AI models that create a digital twin of that. And we train it using historical data, like we said. Now, this AI is not then just left to go and optimize at its own free will. We're actually guiding it by compliance and constraints. So compliance meaning your effluent, your TSS limits coming out, your effluent discharge limits, your water quality limits coming in. Those are constraints the AI has, or they're just maybe operational constraints of how your system operates based on mechanical or structural things. We will capture all those, and the AI will be constrained from not meeting them. And we have a nice little diagram of that in the bottom. We basically apply penalties to the AI, and so basically that white shaded area in the bottom there is where we want the AI, where we want that compliance limit to be operating in. I think here it's maybe a dissolved oxygen level or maybe a TSS. And the red shaded areas is where we don't want the AI to go. And so basically we apply an exponentially increasing penalty function if it starts getting into the area we don't want it to go, and the AI will then shy away from going down that path because it knows it's a high penalty. And so the AI is not just doing this by itself, we are guiding it pretty strongly with compliance and constraints. And then the other thing with AI is it's adaptive in real time. So we mentioned the fact that we have that real-time data, that once we have it trained, we need that real-time data. The reason we need it is because it's adapting to what's actually happening in your system. You get a big rainstorm or something happens, you have a lot more waste today versus yesterday. The AI will see the early indicators of that happening, and it will start adapting the optimizations to that. So you are using the right amount of chemicals at the right time. You're not having to severely overdose later to make up for what happened. So it does adapt in real time to what's happening. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then don't worry, we'll get to the rest of the questions. We'll get answers to them posted back to the folks. But some folks are asking, well, this is all great, but what does the software actually look like? So we didn't get time to do a bit of a demo, but let me jump into a couple quick screens of what the product looks like. So here's the page we call the intelligent control. I think this is the most important one in the limited time we have. But this is really the key things to look at here is along the top, we have cards and we call them site goals. So we'll track KPIs for you or goals of the site. Those may be operational constraints. So effluent TSS is a good one we have here top left. Sludge production, effluent COD, primary TSS, energy consumption. We will build all those KPIs with you, and of course you're free to build more after the fact as well, but make sure we're tracking those key operating constraints and regulatory constraints. And also what our targets are. What are the savings or reduction we're targeting? So we can see how well we're progressing towards that. But more critically at the bottom is we're gonna say, here's the list of set points, as we call them, the key variables in your system to control, to achieve our optimizations, to achieve our goals. So if we're trying to reduce cost here, in this example, the customer is actually controlling their blower, so they're gonna try and reduce energy cost here. What the AI is doing is it's showing you all the black lines here to the left of 80, 40, and 45. That's what's happening in the customer SCADA system today. And then the AI is forecasting the orange and blue going forward. So it's saying for the next 24 hours, here's how you should operate all three of those blowers to use the least amount of energy, but still achieve your production goals and your effluent compliance constraints. And those forecasts will change every couple hours as the inputs coming into the system from SCADA change as well. So we'll keep running optimally. And this is also where you can subscribe and get these recommendations by email and SMS. So every 2 hours, we'll send you a new email saying, okay, here's the next set of changes you need to do. So as an operator, when you're out in the field, you can always have you generally always have your phone with you. You'll be getting these updates about how to control that system, and you can funnel that back into SCADA. But I think that wraps up a lot of the time we have today. I think we may have to get the rest of the questions answered online, but don't worry, those will get posted to you. Alana will have them posted. And I do definitely recommend, if you want to learn more, we are more than happy to talk a bit about it. Reach out to one of our Innovyze experts. We'll do a risk-free assessment. We'll talk more about how AI works or any concerns you have. But we're really excited to learn more about your mining operation and how we can help. Thank you.